Deb Confredo. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 12 for 12, our second 12 for 12. I know that this is going to be a great conversation, and that's exactly what we want to do tonight, is to have a really good and robust conversation about social and emotional learning. Our main presenters tonight, I'm just here to do a little moderation. I'm going to be sort of sinking into the background here. But Bob Morrison, from Director of Arts Ed New Jersey, and Scott Edgar, who's an Associate Professor of Music Ed at Lake Forest College in Illinois. And let me just stop right there. They both wear many, many hats, but just to give you a real quick introduction to them. They're going to be driving the bus most of the way for us tonight. They're key figures of the New Jersey Social Emotional Learning Art Education Task Force, and they're both incredibly instrumental in helping arts educators across the country create impactful student learning environments by uniting, teaching, and learning in our subject areas with beneficial practices of SEL. And tonight we have a lot of ground to cover. We'll likely just scratch the surface tonight. And that's okay. We hope that this conversation will lead to some tangible steps towards improving the already incredibly rich benefits that students receive in music education, and that maybe we can come back together again in the future to have further in-depth discussions. Our roadmap for tonight's event is going to be purposefully broad to allow interaction and spontaneity, right? I want you to feel free to write comments and questions in the chat. I'm going to try to get to as many of those as possible as we move along during this hour. Also, we would like to hear your voices. It's one of the reasons why we chose to use Zoom as our platform for tonight. So when prompted, if you'd like to share a question that way, please feel free. You can use your electronic hand, put it up, and we'll try to get to you as soon as we can. I'm going to put our sort of roadmap in the chat. So let me do that right now for you. And this is kind of just to kind of keep us all together tonight. We may or may not get to all this, but this is just sort of to give us a plan, right? So before we get moving into our first course of business, just a little bit about what we all know. Music is an avenue, isn't it? If it wasn't this avenue that we have, we may not be here. It's an avenue to the mind, to the heart, to the body and the soul. We all know that. We can attest to that through virtue of the fact that we do what we do for a living. And there's an increasing amount of new information coming out of research all the time that demonstrates what we know intuitively, that music changes us. Music makes our lives better in concrete and very, very demonstrable ways. Heck, an entire industry of wellness has grown out of and around music and music therapy. Music therapy has burgeoned over the past several decades, and how wonderful is that? Music also reinforces the social aspect of human interaction, and it's a vehicle for expression and emotion. So really, what better means for development and cultivation of social and emotional learning? And that's why we're all here today. So let's get started with our conversation. Again, we want this to be interactive. Our guests are going to give us some background information. They're going to set us up with some strategies, but we really would like to hear from you, right? So Scotty, I'm sorry, Scott, not Scotty Walker, but Scott, why don't we get started by sharing a bit of background in SEL, sort of, information about what it is and how it's characterized, things of that nature. And then we can move into ideas with you and Bob about bringing social and emotional learning and music education together. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, LMEA. It's such an honor to be able to be here and talk about SEL and music education with you tonight. So, social and emotional learning has been around for 26 years. 26 years ago, some folks got together and built upon some really, really profound work that was done in multiple intelligences, character education, emotional intelligence. If you want to know where this started, well, Dan Goleman wrote a book, and we've started to kind of re-envision what that looked like. And over the last 26 years, we've started to understand that through educational processes, we can skill build to help our students be more self-aware, more socially aware, and to make quality decisions, responsible decisions. And this thing called COVID hit, and then it just accelerated all of this. And it absolutely put it in a space that said social and emotional learning is the educational buzzword right now. And we've heard it more in this last year than we've ever heard. And it's put an onus on us that we feel like we need to figure out a way to do it well, to do it authentically. So you're going to hear Bob and I talk about this up one side and down the other today, that for social and emotional learning to be meaningful and to be effective in our classrooms, it needs to be three things. It needs to be intentional. We need to do it with purpose. We need to say we are doing social and emotional learning. Now, does that mean that we tell that to the students? No. We don't go in and say, hey, it's SEL day, and we go. But in our hearts, we are calling it social and emotional learning. It needs to be embedded. In our case, it needs to be musical. It can never be music, 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 stop, SEL, music, music, music. And it needs to be sustained. One of the biggest questions I get is, hey, Scott, how many minutes do I need to spend on social and emotional learning for it to be meaningful? And I just pause it and I say, wrong question. Wrong question. Because the answer to that question is all of them. All of our minutes need to be musical, and all of our minutes need to be driving this train to help skill build. Now, amidst the challenges that we have faced this last year, we've realized that equity is not happening in our world for a lot of different reasons. So we've restructured social and emotional learning in this last year to have a transformative space. And we've taken these ideas, these big pillars of self, others, and decisions, and we've restructured it in a way that we can truly see it less of something that we do to our students and reframe it as something that we do with our students. So other things that are just inundating us right now, culturally relevant pedagogy goes perfectly in line with this. But we've reframed it to be about identity. Who are our students? Who are we? And how have our experiences framed what the decisions that we're making now? Belonging. Are our spaces safe? Are our spaces safe for our students to be vulnerable and take risks? And do our classrooms have space for agency, for student agency, where their voice can have meaningful and lasting change in classroom, school, and community settings? So that's where we've been, and that's the most recent incarnation is that transformative SEL piece that we're taking up until now. So, mile wide, inch deep, but the 40,000-foot view about social and emotional learning and outlining here's where we can start to translate it for music.
Thank you, Scott. It's a really nice overview, and it really sets the stage very nicely for issues of strategizing. Right? You reminded me of this was way back in the early '90s. It's actually 1994 when the national standards first came out, and the same misconceptions were happening then. Like we do music, 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 and then for 5 minutes maybe we'll do a national standard, and then we'll go to the next class. So yeah, it needs to be embedded. It needs to be really part of our own voices, as much of a part of our own voices as we have wielding a baton, right? So Bob, you want to pick up on where Scott left off?
Well, I'm just going to say thank you for dating us there, Deb, with the 1994 national standards that we were working on at the time.
Sorry about that.
So, there are a couple of things. And actually, I'll come back to the SEL piece, but I want to pick up on one of the things that you touched on regarding wellness and music therapy, because it was actually, in this time in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of work was being done on, looking at the connection with music therapy and the beginning conversations around music and wellness and what was that going to look like. And at the time, both of those were they were still nascent in their development, particularly on the wellness side. Now, music therapy had been around, but in a very, very clinical way. And it's only been really in the past 20 years that it's migrated beyond just the clinical aspect of things in seeing its use in school settings, music therapy in school settings, music therapy in nursing home settings, and other things. And that coincided along with a lot of the Alzheimer's research at the time, and what was music's impact on Alzheimer patients, where you would have patients who, and I'll never forget this story, Andrea Farbman, who was the head of the Music Therapy Association at the time, shared a story of a patient down in Florida, an elderly man who was basically in a vegetated state, But as soon as somebody started playing Anchors Away, all of a sudden he came to life. He got out of his chair, he would stand up and he would salute, because the music reached deep inside of him and pulled him back from wherever Alzheimer's had taken him. And the same thing has been developing as it relates to the wellness side, where at the time, and I remember, these are back in my early days when I was working at NAM in the industry side, Remo Belli, Remo Drum Company, worked very closely and was part of a hearing at the U.S. Senate with Mickey Hart, talking about the wellness aspects of drumming and the healing aspects of drumming and music. And a lot of people thought they were just out of their minds. They just thought they were crazy. And now here we are, and they were right. They were right about the health connections, regarding regarding music, and particularly the therapeutic, connections as it relates to music. Now, I tell you all of this to kind of set the stage for where we are with SEL. And I see some very similar patterns. And one of the things I think is important to understand is that everyone thinks that SEL is important now because of COVID, right? That COVID just kind of, set it on fire. Actually, as Scott laid out, it was emerging. And I'm a sitting Board of Education member here in New Jersey, and I sit on our state school boards association. So I interact with a lot of superintendents and other school board members and everything else. And I can tell you, prior to the pandemic, social emotional learning was becoming a priority for all of us. Now, why was that? Well, because of a lot of the concerns that we were having as we were looking at our students and how they were coming into school and what their concerns are and things that they were dealing with, whether it was school shootings, whether it was anxiety, whether it was homework anxiety, whether all of these other things that were increasing levels of stress on our students, as well as an uptick in what we have seen with student mental health issues, including attempted suicide and suicide. So all of these things really were manifesting themselves as we came into the pandemic. So SEL was really coming up to the top of the list for a lot of people. And then we hit the pandemic. And then it's like somebody strapped booster rockets onto the whole issue, because now everybody is saying it, from the U.S. Department of Education to any state reopening plan to any district reopening plan. Social emotional learning has to be front and center as our students work their way back into our school buildings. So this is the environment that the connection between music education and social emotional learning has been evolving. And because of the great work that Scott has been doing over the past several years, and then a lot of the work that has taken place over the past 2 years to really put a spotlight on this, has helped people really begin to recognize the power that music has for addressing these social emotional learning needs of our students. Now, just because it doesn't mean that it actually happens, right? As Scott said, it has to be intentional, has to be embedded, has to be sustained. We have to be intentional about it. We can't just sit there and say, oh, it's just going to happen. But the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that the experiences that we create for our students that relate to their social emotional learning needs, we need to determine whether or not those experiences will be positive or whether they'll be negative, right? Because we are aware of negative, certainly negative experiences that have been created in some of our music classrooms. And we need to understand, when we're approaching this, the unique role that we as music educators have. And I just want to make this one point, and then I'll stop. We have this unique set of circumstances, unlike almost any other teacher in our schools. And the fact that youth development is centered around, and the research that we talk about is centered around the fact that developmental experiences plus developmental relationships are the foundational elements of young adult success. And so when it comes to, having those, meaningful relationships, right? those occur in our music classrooms because we have the advantage of time. We see students more frequently for the tenure of their education than just about any other teacher. So if you have them in the elementary school, you see them every grade in elementary school, when in their regular classroom, they're being passed from one classroom to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. So we have the opportunity to have those sustained developmental relationships that other teachers don't necessarily have the students long enough to be able to sustain that. And the same is true in our middle schools and high schools. And it's because of that unique time, we're in a great position to have a positive influence. But again, we have to be committed to making those interactions positive. So I think it's important to recognize that the unique thing that we have as music educators is our time to create these developmental relationships, and the fact that we're working with something that by its very nature is emotional. Music is emotional, right? The arts are emotional. So therefore, we have this powerful combination of these emotional developmental experiences that we can create for our students, and the benefit of time that allows us to create these developmental relationships.
Bob, thanks for that. And wow, I mean, it just opens up a.
Sorry. Scott's ready to jump in.
Yeah, and just 10 seconds, Scott. It just sort of opens the whole sort of Pandora's box of what SEL is, what it can be, and really what our responsibilities are. I couldn't help but be reminded of things that I teach my students, and that is that we work in loco parentis, right? When kids come to us, we are the family. We are part of their family. We help with that developmental process, and we need to take on that responsibility very, very seriously. And it includes more than just notes and rhythms, right? Which I think is what you're saying, Scott.
Yeah, Deb, just really, really quickly, because as we start to talk
Take as much time as you want.
Oh, as we start to talk about music therapy, it kind of goes back to when I started to discover SEL. That, I was a K-12 teacher who didn't do SEL. I didn't know about SEL when I was a middle school and high school band director. That wasn't on my radar. And I think that where it came from was this idea that when I think music therapy, I think a lot of our music educators think, oh man, he's going to make me a counselor. He's going to make me a therapist. And as loudly as I can say without screaming, we are not counselors. We are not therapists. And SEL is not counseling, and SEL is not therapy. But this introduced this need that students would come to us and they want us to be counselors and they want us to be therapists. So what SEL is for me at its simplest are ways that we can help our students build skills to build their preventative mental health capacity. Once we get into the reactionary side of things, when we get to a diagnosis, when we get to something that really does need something other than we learn through music education, that's when we need our mental health professionals now more than ever.
Let me play devil's advocate here for just a moment for both of you. Suppose we're having this discussion about SEL, and the feedback that you get from a music teacher is, I'm a music teacher, right? I teach music. I don't need that stuff. In fact, there's no time for that. What would your response be? I mean, I think I know what it would be, but
and I'm going to be honest. In every single professional development that I've done over the last 10 years, there's one person. There's one person who's sitting there like this and who is just like, not my job. Not my job. My job is to teach notes and rhythms. And I would posit it like this, that if I were to ask us what skills we build in a music classroom, we would get the trigger the D, shift on the violin, hear so me. We would get all of that. But we would also get a laundry list of life skills that we hope our students get through our experiences. What social and emotional learning does is it gives us a construct. It gives us a way to put words to that, to vocalize that, to take these half-baked ideas that we hope our students are building through their time with us and put it back in the SEL oven for 20 more minutes and just bake it a little bit more so that we have some of that intentionality. And we discover ways that I think a lot of those benefits that we hope our students get through their time with us, they get it on the other side of music. They get it because we come together as community. Well, what Bob and I are suggesting is that there's ways that we actually embed it into the musical process, that there are ways that it is not an either or, it is always and. So finding easy ways, whether it be giving some space for students to do some fist to five self-analysis. How well did that rhythm line up? Fist to five. How focused were you on that rep? Fist to five. How well did that major second really clash, and how well did we resolve? What is one thing that you want to fix on this next rep instead of me dictating? All of that sounds like good music teaching. And to me, all of that sounds like SEL.
You know, you reminded me of, and I'm going to go back to what Bob said. You know, I'm one of the seasoned people on this call too, right? So been around for a while, and when you're around for a while, you develop a lot of stuff that you've done, right? And one of the things that I've done a lot of, and lots of people on this call have done a lot of, is adjudications that involve clinics, right? And so one of the things that I do, and I'm sure that a bunch of you do this as well, you listen to a group perform, and then you hop up on stage with them, you start working with them. And I always begin those clinics with, think about two things. One thing that you really thought you did great, you knocked it out of the park as an individual or as a group, and something that you'd like to take back and have a do-over, right? And it always saddens me and amazes me the amount of kids, the number of kids who do not want to share an opinion. And I don't know why, but my guess is this, I mean, this goes to the agency piece, that they have not been given those opportunities, or those opportunities are few and far between. And we are, I saw Sarah said, we don't teach robots, but if all we're doing is pushing buttons and, or opening our mouths without this other dimension, and that agency that you're talking about, then maybe that is what we're doing. So being able to, you know, let them know that they should have an opinion. They should be thinking about those things as they're performing. Bob?
Yeah, I think the one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind that, you know, kind of Scott talked about, is we're really talking about just opening the aperture, right? And so if we're focused on the music piece here, we're just focused really intently on, are we getting the notes and rhythms right and everything else? If you open the aperture just a little bit more to engage the students, to ask them to reflect, to ask them to provide feedback, to discuss some things philosophically about you know, how, you know, what was going on in the piece. What was the composer's intent? You know, what were they trying to convey? What do you think was going on that may have motivated, you know, that within the composer? All of these things that we just talked about are activating SEL competencies, right? And that's the whole idea of what we're talking about, is using music to activate those competencies within SEL, to really, you know, enliven them. So that's when we talk about being intentional, some people go, well, you know, I do SEL, I already do it, you know, in my room. And a lot of places they are doing it, but they're doing it by accident. And what we're talking about is doing it intentional, by really planning out how you're doing it and embedding it into the curriculum and really opening that aperture.
So let's talk about that for just a minute, about this intentionality piece, right? Because there is a difference between doing it sort of haphazardly or even naturally, not recognizing that you're doing it, but it's in there anyway. But that intentionality piece takes it to the next level. What is the benefit of doing it, and how do I approach things with more intentionality, so that I can look back and reflect and feel, you know, okay, we got to this place, we need to go a little bit further, you know, that self-evaluation. You know what I mean? Didn't say that very well.
No, it's perfect. And Bob, I think that, you know, I would be remiss, I'm not the one to talk about this, but the work that you've done in New Jersey on the framework, I think just hits this out of the park. The work that they've done in New Jersey has taken the National Core Arts Standards, which again have started to just find their way into our teaching. You know, at the very simplest, comprehensive musicianship. I'm teaching a class at Vandercook College of Music right now, And one of the leaders in comprehensive musicianship is in the class. And I am learning so much about how the affective domain and how all of the heart of a piece of music, how it just does this with social and emotional learning. So, the work that they're doing in New Jersey really took those national core arts standards and our social and emotional learning standards. And I think it's translation, Deb. I think it's all about translation in a way that our music teachers can understand. So, Bob, I don't want to go any further and talk about the great work that you've done, but man, the gold standard's right in front of us.
So, and I think this will allow us to kind of get into down into the weeds just a little bit more. But Deb threw into the chat the link here. This is the social emotional learning framework that we put together with arts education. This is part of now living at the Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning, which Scott and I will talk a little bit about later. But basically what we did is we took the 4 artistic processes from the standards: create, perform, respond, connect, and the 5 SEL competencies and their subcompetencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, and put a matrix together. And we had a team looked at the more than 200 intersections between the 19 subcompetencies and the 11 anchor standards in the art standards to explore what is the intersection of how create and self-awareness connect. Where are those connections? So we created this framework and then put it all together in a website to make it easy for people to navigate. So if I come over here and explore the intersection between create and self-awareness, it will take me down a level and show me now the anchor standards. So you have the anchor standards, and along with the anchor standards, you have the subcompetencies that are tied to self-awareness. So there are 4 subcompetencies in self-awareness, and we have the 3 anchor standards within the create aspect. And so what we're looking at is how do we best put these things together? So if you hover over the little I for information, it will show you what the EUs and EQs are for that particular anchor standard in the arts language. And then you have recognizing one's feelings and thoughts, which is the SEL subcompetency. And what we ended up doing is we rewrote the anchor standards anchor standards to come up with new essential questions and enduring understandings that reflected the intersection of both. And that's why you see here that we talk about one's feelings, thoughts, personal strengths, challenges influence the creative process, with an EQ of how does the awareness of one's strengths, challenges, feelings, and thoughts influence the generation of creative ideas. This gets into a whole conversation with students when you're talking about a piece. What was the composer's intent? What were they thinking about? How did the piece make you feel? How did it, based on your own experience, how did that make you react to something? So now all of a sudden we've taken this idea of, how does an artist generate creative ideas, and now plugged in the SEL component on how does the awareness of your strengths, challenges, feelings, and thoughts influence the generation of creative ideas. And that is the intersection. So what we've done here is we did this for all of the intersections. Additionally, what we've included is grade band indicators for what's appropriate activities or what are appropriate indicators for grade level SEL based on a particular subcompetency. And these grade level indicators are early elementary, late elementary, middle school, and high school. And you can see the difference between early elementary, where they talk about recognize and name different types of positive and negative emotions. That's at the early elementary stage, versus at the high school stage, analyze how one's own thoughts and emotions affect decision-making and responsible behavior, right? Very different. So the idea here is to provide a tool for a music educator and art teacher to come in and review a lesson that they're working on to look at how they can embed the SEL component into that. And if you click down further, we'll then take you down into an area that will bring you to example lesson plans and other information. So, and for those of you that don't like navigating a website, we actually have the downloads where you can download in each of the artistic processes these intersections written out. It won't have everything, but for those that want to lay everything out on the table, it will get you there. But that's, in essence, the whole idea was, what are the intentional intersections? How do we articulate that for music educators so they can use that as part of curriculum writing or the development of lesson plans? And then, but then the other reason for doing this is so that our arts educators, our music educators, can go to their administrators and demonstrate and show them, this is how we make these connections. This is how we are impacting our students through music education to activate SEL aspects within learning.
Bob, I was glad that, thank you for this. This is great. And thanks, Scott, for tossing those PDFs up in the chat. Everybody can go to those as well. I'm glad that you mentioned curricular issues, creating lesson plans. To what extent should issues of SEL appear in curricular development, right? So in other words, if I'm going back to, in early elementary stages, students should be able to do this, late elementary this, middle school this, high school this. Should they sit side by side, or is there a way to connect the musical skills with these SEL benchmarks?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and if you look at the performance framework, you can see where those connections are made. And one of the things that I would argue, and what we're doing here in the state of New Jersey, because we just adopted new visual and performing arts standards, and we've got a 2-year window for all of our districts to revise their district level standards. We've set up this framework so that the connection is there between our standards and the SEL framework that we've established, so that as our writing teams are revising their curriculum, they're doing so through the lens of the SEL component. So they're keeping that in mind as they're revising their own district standards, instead of revising their standards and then all of a sudden going, oh, we should have embedded the SEL standards at the same time. So that's, that was one of the motivating factors for us. So I would encourage folks, when they get to the point where they are rewriting curriculum or they're reworking lesson plans, do it through the lens of being inclusive of the SEL elements here. And I didn't get into very deeply because we'd spend the entire evening on this. But there are great intersections between diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are great connections to the things that Scott talked about regarding identity, belonging, and agency that can be made meaningful here. And I think that it's, I think that's where the power of this is in bringing together all of these threads and embedding it into the curriculum so that we can be intentional about activating these issues for our students.
Thanks, Bob. And that's actually a great segue into those ideas. Scott, you want to take us into that a little bit?
So we have to help teachers see exactly what this looks like in their classrooms. And, I started to kind of hint at how we are, whether it be a fist of 5 or whether it be an exit slip or whether it be for our younger students, when we're allowed to have manipulatives, mood marbles, a red marble, a yellow marble, a blue marble. So we just look in the jar and we see a snapshot of where our students are. But, I want to start by saying it is very rarely a good idea to go into a classroom and say, how are you feeling? And thinking that we're doing SEL. That's not going to elicit the result that you want. Very few people want to talk that vulnerably right off the bat. So there are ways that we can kind of back end into it. There's ways that, as Alex Shapiro says, we can use music as a portal. We can use music as a portal to have the conversations that we need to have in our classrooms. And, especially as Bob was saying, as we're starting to necessitate this need to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and to talk about anti-racism, and to talk about this need that our music classrooms provide a space. The light bulb moment for me was when I realized that if we don't talk about it, that if we are afraid to talk about it, our classroom automatically becomes unsafe for some students. Our fear to talk about this makes our classroom unsafe for some students. And the way that we're going to do it is the exact same way that Mr. Rogers did it in 1969. He did it by modeling. He did it in a way that was developmentally appropriate. And he did it through art. He did it through TV. We're going to do it through music. But he put his feet into a kiddie pool with Officer Clemens. You know, that was modeling. It was through art. And that action spoke louder than 100 million words. So what I would suggest is, as we're starting to think about how do we do this? How do we do this in our classroom? It always has to start with the music. It always has to start with our noun. So it has to start with the repertoire. It has to start with our awareness of whether it be the second grade folk song that we're singing or the upper level symphony orchestra piece. How is the music going to connect to our students? How are we going to be able to be culturally relevant to our students in so many definitions and incarnations of that term? But that music's going to be our inroad. It's going to be our portal. And from there, we can start to better understand our students' identity. We can start to say, okay, so when's a moment in your life when this piece, which whether it be program music or not, is going to start to better understand that this piece of music's going to come with our students, whether they love it or they hate it. I know I still remember a piece of music from high school that I couldn't stand, and I remember it just as much as the piece that I fell in love with. The pieces connect with us. From there, we start to understand that in music, you can't hide, right? In music, you're out there. That vulnerability is mandated. So that's where belonging comes in. So when we're looking at how do we facilitate this in our classrooms, identity, the number one thing that we can do is to give our students, as Bob said, an opportunity to reflect. Now, writing isn't always the best way to do this, but we need to give our students an opportunity to reflect before and after, to set their own goals and to self-assess. Those are the two biggest things we can do to help our students better understand their musical identity, to set their own goals and to self-assess. When we start to get into belonging, it is all about helping our students be empathetic. How can they be empathetic to their own worldview, to musics that resonate with them, to musics that don't resonate with them, to listen harder than we speak? And as musicians, we think, oh, we're really good listeners. I'm going to disagree with that one. That I think that oftentimes if we listened as well in our day-to-day lives as we think we listen musically, we'd be further down that train track. And then the last piece of agency is all about us stopping this role as we are the fixer. You know, we fix notes, we fix rhythms. That's not really getting at this piece of agency in our classroom. As opposed to saying, here's how you fix it, reframing that as, how are we going to fix this? And have the students start to throw the solutions at us. And when that happens, not only are they having agency in the classroom, but they're learning that their decisions can affect meaningful change, and they're learning how to make a responsible decision.
Scott, let's stay on that for a little bit, for both of you, actually. You know, we're in such a top-down profession in many ways, right? So in fact, we stand on a box that sets us above people, right? We stand away from them, right? And you know, the term I use is, and this is not, doesn't have anything to do with plumbers being bad, right? So when do you need a plumber? You need a plumber when something's broken, right? And so band, orchestra, choir directors are sort of, we act as plumbers sometimes. Well, I'm listening, fix it, listening, fix it, listening, fix it, rather than the development of a work from the ground up together. I think that's one of the things that you're talking about here. How can we do this, right? And so to let go of that sense of control sometimes is going to be hard for some folks, right? What would the both of you, can you both suggest some ways, some practical strategies that we can use to help us to let go of those reins, knowing that things are not going to fall apart? In fact, if we dig into some of these tenets and bring them and start to embed them in what we do, things are actually probably going to get pretty good.
You know, I think the first thing that we need to do is to realize that we're in an apprenticeship profession, meaning we teach how we were taught. And the models that have led us up until here are so ingrained that I know we have teacher educators here on this call, that our 4 years that we have with them to get them into that first teaching job, so hard to break. everything that had good, bad, and ugly that had come with them to that point. So the challenge there is zebras and stripes. You know, how do we get zebras to change their stripes when that is the model of music education that is in our DNA? It's in our music pedagogical DNA. So I think the most powerful thing that this pandemic has brought about is this idea that, hey, if I'm going to try something, I'm going to try it now. You know, I don't have this huge performance expectation. Most of us don't. And that I have time, I have space. The students need meaningful engagement in our musical education process when the performance isn't put on the pedestal that we've put it on for so long. So I think now's the time to start to experiment. And you're right, it just takes a little bit for us to see that when the students experience agency, when the students experience this ability to make an authentic choice in their classroom, that one, they're going to be motivated. They're going to be more motivated to achieve the results that we're all after anyway. But I'm reminded of the mantra that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And, you know, I think for a lot of our students, they think that we're kind of going alone. We're following the one leader and our music's come together. But if we can really, truly build that sense of belonging and agency, we're going to go a lot farther. It just takes a little more time.
Bob, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's just, it comes back to, you know, why we should be doing this to begin with, right? This is about the students. This is about the students' needs. It's about meeting them where they are, particularly in this moment. And for a lot of folks, I think it's going to be important to recognize that, you know, we've lost some students. You know, a lot of students have disappeared because for them, it hasn't been any fun trying to learn to play on Zoom. And they've given up, and it's hard to recruit for those that have not come back in person, you know, fully in many places. It's hard to recruit remotely. And so, you know, we really have to be focused on the students. We have to be focusing on opening up all the doors and windows to let them in, at whatever grade level, at whatever ability level, let them in. Right? They want to play. They want to be involved in music. There's something magical about it. And we've just got to make sure that we are open to allowing all of the students to come in and providing pathways for, you know, students that disappeared this year, that we can go back and recapture them. You know, maybe we're starting 2 years of beginners. Maybe we're recruiting 9th grade students that have never played before. Whatever it takes to allow students the opportunity to reconnect, that's going to be part of the challenge. But that has to be the central focus of focusing on the students. So what if you don't have a balanced ensemble? I don't care. You know, I want all kids. I want more kids. I want to see a full music room of kids making music together, doing the best they can. And so what if it's not the perfect instrumentation? That shouldn't be the goal. It needs to be focused on the students.
Right. It's our group, not my group, as the director, right? Let me ask you this, and I also want to remind everybody that if you do have questions, you can use your virtual hand and raise, and we want to hear from you. I'm going to go back to just for a moment. I have my other screen right here. And I'm looking at, I think this is in Create, right? Recognize one's feelings and thoughts. I'm just going to stay right with that first box. And this is for either one of you. Suppose, you know, you're implementing, you're doing this, you're really working your music and issues of SEL side by side, and it's, you know, you feel really good about it, but there's one or two kids who just, you know, you can't get them there, right? They just can't come along. Maybe it's too much of a vulnerable position for them, and you're starting to get concerned. What then? What do we do then?
Well, I'm going to suggest that we certainly can't put SEL into chronological buckets, that we know plenty of adults who never reach social and emotional competency, and that we need to understand that students are in that same conversation, that they are developmentally coming along of this journey. The question that I always ask isn't the question of what is happening. The question is why. You know, the students have a story. They have something that we need to know. So I often encourage us to play detective. You know, when we see that type of interaction in our classroom, that's the tip of the iceberg. And underneath the water are so many experiences. You know, right now the two biggest I would call them down emotions that we're seeing are anxiety and fear and anger. There's three. But those three emotions are the presenting emotions. The underlying emotions are fear, anxiety, frustration, boredom. And all of those things can lead to pushback, can lead to disengagement, can lead to slowing a social and emotional trajectory in skill building. So those students, along with exactly what you just said, you know, the vulnerability piece, it's that might not be, we also need to remember that social and emotional expression is highly cultural, that their life experiences and with the homes and cultures that they come from highly dictate how comfortable they are expressing that level of vulnerability. So all of this comes together to a space that we need to be empathetic, to show grace, and understand that everyone is on a journey. And just because a student isn't expressing themselves how we're defining as the appropriate incarnation of a social and emotional product, that doesn't mean that they're, one, not getting something out of it, and two, not engaging thoughtfully in the process.
Right. You know, I was glad, Scott, that you brought up that the idea of students coming from different places, right? I had a class right before we came on tonight, undergraduate class, and I played for them a 7-minute film called Girls Like Me, right? And it had a handful of young Black girls who were talking about difficulties of wearing their hair naturally, the difference between light and dark skin, and then went to the doll experiment. You guys probably know the doll experiment, where there's 2 baby dolls and 4-year-old Black children were brought in. Show me the one that you like. And in this, it was not the original experiment, but one a little bit later. 21 kids out of 21, 15 chose the white doll. Show me the good doll. All of them chose the white doll, right? So we talked about that my kids were just devastated. But we talked about it in terms of identity, right? And they were angry with what they saw, but they couldn't make that transfer into their profession, right? And so the way I got them to think about it that way was, what do you have that you identify with in your family, that's part of who you are? And that came out. What Scott, what you were just talking about came out. Some kids were talking about their families being very huggy and open and supportive, and they could talk about anything to their family. And other kids, no, we don't do that. We're very closed. We keep our emotions to ourselves. It's you know, you don't cry in front of your father or your mother or whatever. So I think that's a really important point for us to think about, that not everybody can just be open about things. Brett had a comment in the chat that I want to point your attention to. How do I become more sensitive to a student's ill-timed emotional breakdown when I have a music deadline? That was today, by the way. And Bob, I think you you responded, there's never a well-timed breakdown. You want to take that one?
Well, I think that, you know, I think we have to, one of the things that Scott and I talk a lot about is that we're not trying to turn music educators into social workers, into school counselors, right? And there is going to be, you know, there's certain strategies that you can use, you know, in your classroom with students, you know, up to a certain point, but then it's going to move beyond your capability. And that's why you have school counselors. That's why they're there to be able to help you in those situations. I think in this particular one, you know, if it's a student that just had an ill-timed breakdown and it was uncharacteristic for that student, that would be one thing, versus here it's another breakdown that is consistently happening with the student, and there's something triggering them. That's a completely different set of circumstances. So I think it really comes from a standpoint of what's the history with that particular student, meaning to determine then what are the next steps that you take. But certainly, like anything else, and we've talked about this, a lot. Students won't learn until they feel safe, right? So obviously, there's something that's going on that triggered that particular student, that made them feel anxious to the point where they had a breakdown. So the first thing that you need to do is work to try to de-escalate it so that they can feel safe again before you can actually move forward with them. And you know what? Sometimes it's going to come at the worst possible time. And the reality is you still have to address the issue with the student. Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, no, I was acknowledging. Yeah, perfect, Bob. Thank you. Brett, as much as I can suggest that it's a backhanded compliment, that they feel safe enough to have the meltdown in your space, and that they wouldn't feel that safety to just melt down anywhere. They saved it for you. Lucky you, I know. But that's the relationship, and that's what happens in relationships. Is we let our guard down, and sometimes we rip the band-aids off at the not the right time. So I put it in there. But it kind of reminds me of the movie Inside Out, that all emotions make sense. That we need to validate all emotions. Anger makes sense. Our goal is to just de-escalate that, to lower the temperature, to feel angry, but to realize that having a conversation afterwards, be like, you know what, man, that was a tough one for you, wasn't it? Okay, so what are some other ways that you can still feel angry, but what are other manifestations of that? And how could we maybe think about, if there was frustrating, granted, if there was a musical product, maybe that musical push for perfection, music that I wasn't there, but that musical push for them to put pressure on themselves, maybe that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe that challenge was just another thing that was just like tough we pandemic, everything else. This, just that little bit. Absolutely.
So we are, believe it or not, we are barreling down on the end of our hour here. It's hard to believe. So here's what I'd like to do. We have about 5 minutes left, and let me remind everybody that we will, our guests have to leave, but we will kind of hang out for about 15 minutes afterwards if you'd like to participate in sort of a virtual happy hour where we continue to have this conversation. So we'll be around. But for Scott and Bob, what I'd like you to do is, if you can brainstorm a little bit for us and with us about if there's one thing that we can do tomorrow, the people on this call, right? If there's one thing that you wish that we could do tomorrow, that we have the tools for right now, as a one step in towards implementation of social emotional learning in our music classrooms, without that large looming task of having to redo my entire curriculum today, what would that be?
Two quick things. One, think about how you're going to reframe whatever repertoire you're going to expose to your students tomorrow to connect with your students' lives. To think about how you're going to make that piece relevant for them, and to think about some form of reflection, to get your students just to think. And that doesn't always mean writing. I think that that's where our brains go. At the very least, kindergartners aren't going to give you a well thought out paragraph. But that also means that not every student is able or wanting to reflect in that. So maybe it's through a musical improvisation, maybe it's through a drawing, maybe it's through a doodle, maybe it's through turn talk to your neighbor or roses and thorns, maybe it's through a Google form. How you reflect is highly personal to you, your context, and how it's going to resonate with your students. The important thing is you ask them to reflect.
So the one thing that I would suggest, and shameless plug, we just launched a week or two ago, I think, the Center for Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. And I point you to that as a resource to connect to, because there's a lot of great information here where we've had folks that have been curating some of the best research, the best information, the best articles, the best webinars that deal with the topic. And you can go in and actually sort information based on the discipline, whether you're looking for a webinar, whether you're looking for a research report, whether you're looking for an article, and in what particular area that you're interested in focusing on. And it will then bring up all of the best resources that we've been able to identify and already curating them, so that you don't have to go out and what's the best thing for this. We've actually started to curate this information based on the philosophy that we've shared with you about the fact that it needs to be intentional, it needs to be embedded, and it needs to be sustained. So instead of looking for a bunch of resources, you can come here to ArtsEd SEL to take a look at some of the latest information that's available. And I think that just perusing around there will help you, begin to connect more deeply to these connections between social emotional learning and music education. By getting informed about it yourself, then you can work on how you can apply it in your own practice.
Great, thanks for that. And I can tell you, because I've tooled around on the website quite a bit. It's a treasure trove of information. I would highly recommend everybody taking a walk through it at the very least. Cameron has one last question here, and he says, how do we, this might take more than 30 seconds, so I'm just going to give you the heads up. How do we focus more on progress and less on perfection? Building healthier relationships are not cookie cutter. So maybe that might take about a minute and a half.
I think it comes down to 3 really simple words. Ask your students. And oftentimes I think that, again, it's a one-way arrow. And we've painted ourselves into a corner. And I think we've all felt it during the pandemic. We felt, well, if I can't do a concert, then what do I do? We've done our job so well that we've convinced ourselves, our students, our administrators, the families, that performance is the end-all be-all. And we've learned that the process is what has gotten us through this last year. So I hope it's the genie out of the bottle. I hope that we've realized that our students have found not been given voices, because they've always had voices. We've amplified their voices, and that they've enjoyed that has deepened their personal experience with music education. And if we can start to think about that moving forward, and not saying that musical excellence isn't important, because it is, but there is a way that it is not or, and it's and, that our students' voices can be part of that process in a new and deeper way.
Great, thank you, Scott. Bobby, would you like to add to that?
No, I think that was perfectly well said.
Well, with that then, and I hate to say it, but we are at the top of the hour, and our guests need to leave. We will stick around, but please, could we all thank them for their expertise and their willingness to spend this time with us for this second 12 for 12. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Scott from LMEA. We appreciate you more than we can say.
Thank you. Be safe and be well.
Take care.